What happens when a woman in a wedding dress flees her own wedding, only to find herself face to face with the one person who was waiting for her? Susan Davison thought she was escaping into the unknown when she hid in that black luxury car during a torrential storm. But Alexander Graves wasn't a stranger. He was someone who knew every one of her secrets, every tear, every reason why she was running away. But what happened next? No one there could have imagined. If this story moves you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Rain fell like divine judgment, each drop hitting the asphalt with the force of Susan's erratic heartbeats. Her wedding dress, once pristine ivory silk that had cost more than most people's cars, now clung to her trembling body like a second skin, heavy with water and laden with regret. The delicate hand-beaded pearls caught the harsh streetlights, creating fragmented rainbows that mocked the dreams she had abandoned at the altar. "I can't do this," she had whispered to herself just 20 minutes earlier, standing in the bridal suite while her mother adjusted her veil with anxious hands. The words had escaped before she could stop them, hanging in the perfumed air like a confession. Her mother's hands had frozen mid-adjustment, and in that suspended moment, Susan saw her entire future flash before her eyes, a future that looked more like a prison sentence than a fairy tale. Gregory Steele. Even his name sounded like a weapon, sharp and unforgiving. The man she was supposed to marry, the man her father insisted would save the family from financial ruin, the man whose smile never reached his calculating grey eyes, whose touch made her skin crawl with revulsion instead of sing with pleasure. "You look pale, darling," her mother had said, her voice tight with the kind of desperation that comes from drowning in debt. Maybe a little more blush? But Susan knew that no amount of makeup could color the emptiness she felt inside. She had nodded silently, allowed herself to be beautified and perfected, while her soul screamed for freedom. The breaking point came when Gregory himself appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like smoke from an all-consuming fire. "My beautiful bride," he had murmured, moving toward her with predatory grace. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, and she felt nothing but disgust. "In just a few minutes you'll be mine, completely mine." The possessive tone in his voice had shattered something fragile inside her chest. Without thinking, without planning, Susan did the only thing that felt right. She ran. Now, as thunder rolled overhead like an angry god, she found herself in the parking lot of the luxury hotel where her reception was supposed to be taking place. Inside, 300 guests waited for a bride who would never return. Her designer shoes had been abandoned somewhere between the chapel and the street, leaving her barefoot on the cold asphalt. The parking lot stretched before her like an ocean of metal and glass, filled with cars belonging to wedding guests who would soon discover her absence. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized she had nowhere to go, no plan beyond this desperate escape. Her purse, her phone, her entire life. Everything was back in that suffocating bridal suite. That's when she saw it, an immaculate black sedan parked in the shadows, away from the hotel's main lights. It was different from the other cars, quieter, more elegant, as if it held secrets. The windows were too dark to see through, but something about the vehicle called to her. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was survival instinct, but Susan ran toward it. Her trembling hands found the rear door handle. By some miracle she didn't question, it was unlocked. Susan slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click that sounded like freedom. The interior was luxurious, soft leather that smelled of rich wood, and a subtle masculine cologne that somehow calmed her. She curled up in the back seat, trying to make herself invisible, trying to disappear completely. Water from her hair dripped onto the leather seats, and she hugged her knees to her chest, shivering not just from the cold, but from the magnitude of what she had just done. "You're safe now." A deep, calm voice echoed in the darkness. Susan froze. Slowly, very slowly, her eyes adjusted to the shadows and she saw a silhouette in the driver's seat. A man was there, motionless, as if he had been waiting for her all along. Who are you?" Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. He turned, and even in the dim light she could see the outline of a strong face, eyes that seemed to see right through her soul. "My name is Alexander Graves," he said, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't identify. "And I know exactly who you are, Susan Davison," The way he said her name, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with something that sounded dangerously close to recognition, made her heart race again. "How do you—" "I know about Gregory Steele," Alexander continued, his voice cutting through the storm raging outside. "I know about your father's debts, about the marriage that was arranged to save him from bankruptcy, and I know you just did the bravest thing of your life." Susan felt tears burn her eyes. How was it possible that a complete stranger knew about her life, about her deepest secrets? "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. Not yet." Alexander started the engine, and the sound was almost silent, like a powerful cat awakening. "But you need to know that you're not alone, Susan, and you need to know that Gregory Steele isn't just your enemy." His words hung in the charged air between them, full of unspoken promises and threats. Susan could feel that her life was about to change completely, that this impossible encounter in the middle of a storm was just the beginning of something much bigger. As the car moved smoothly through the wet streets, leaving behind the hotel and all traces of the life she had rejected, Susan wondered if she had run toward salvation or toward something even more dangerous than the marriage she had fled. The silence inside the car was thick as black velvet, broken only by the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers battling the storm. Susan remained curled up in the back seat, watching the city lights transform into golden blurs through the wet glass. Each block they passed took her further from Gregory, further from the suffocating life she had almost accepted as her fate. Alexander drove with the confidence of someone who knew every street, every curve, every secret the city held. His long, elegant fingers gripped the steering wheel firmly, but Susan noticed how they tightened slightly whenever they passed under a streetlight, as if he were fighting against memories that insisted on surfacing. "Where are we going?" she finally managed to ask, her voice sounding small in the car's enclosed space. "To a place where you can breathe," Alexander replied, without taking his eyes off the road. "And where we can talk without being interrupted." There was something in the way he said the word interrupted that made Susan realize they weren't just escaping from the rain. They were running from something, or someone, much more dangerous. The car stopped in front of a 24-hour cafe that looked like something out of a 1940s film noir. Red neon lights reflected on the wet sidewalk, creating a scene that was both welcoming and mysterious. Alexander finally turned to face her, and for the first time Susan could clearly see the man who had become her unlikely savior. He was younger than his voice suggested, perhaps in his late 30s, with sculpted features that seemed carved from marble. His eyes were such a deep blue they reminded her of the ocean during a storm, and there was a sharp intelligence in them that made her feel as if he could read her every thought. But it was the thin scar cutting across his left eyebrow that captured her attention, a mark that spoke of battles fought and costly victories. "You're cold," he observed, noticing how she was still shivering. Without waiting for an answer, Alexander removed his coat, an expensive wool overcoat, and offered it to her. "Put this on." Susan hesitated for a moment before accepting the garment. The coat still held the warmth from his body, and that subtle masculine cologne she had noticed when she got into the car. It was comforting in a way that made her question why she was trusting a complete stranger. "I'm not a complete stranger," Alexander said, as if he had read her mind. "I've known you far longer than you imagine, Susan." She pulled the coat tighter around her body. "Should that comfort me or scare me?" A smile touched the corners of Alexander's mouth, the first she had seen, and it was surprisingly warm. "That depends on how brave you really are." They entered the cafe together, an odd pair, she in a mud-stained wedding dress covered by a men's overcoat, he in an impeccable suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. The middle-aged waitress who served them didn't even blink. In a city like this, she had probably seen everything. Alexander chose a table in the farthest corner, where the shadows were deepest and conversations couldn't be overheard. He ordered black coffee for both of them and waited until they were alone before speaking again. "Your father, James Davison, was a partner in an import and export company called Meridian Trading," he began, his voice low but clear. 3 years ago, the company went bankrupt due to a series of bad investments and fraudulent contracts. Your father lost everything, the house, the savings, his reputation. That's when Gregory Steele appeared with his generous marriage offer. Susan felt her blood run cold. How do you know that? Because I made it my business to know. Alexander leaned forward, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. Gregory isn't just a powerful man who collects trophy wives, Susan. He's a predator who feeds on others' misfortune. And 18 years ago, he destroyed my family in exactly the same way he destroyed yours. Susan's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. 18 years? My father, Robert Graves, had an expanding technology company. We were prosperous, happy, until Gregory showed up with a partnership contract that seemed too good to be true. Alexander's voice grew colder, loaded with an old and well-guarded anger. Because it was. The contract was fraudulent. My father lost everything overnight, the company, the house, his dignity. Susan set her cup back on the saucer with shaking hands. What happened to him? He never recovered. Died of a heart attack 2 years later, still fighting to clear his name. Alexander paused, and for a moment the mask of control slipped, revealing the raw pain underneath. I was 16. I was placed in foster homes, lost touch with my younger sister. Gregory Steele didn't just destroy our business, he shattered my family. The silence that followed was loaded with mutual understanding. Susan finally understood why Alexander knew so much about her life, why he had been waiting for her in that car. They were bound by more than coincidence. They were bound by revenge. Why did you tell me this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you have something I need, Alexander replied, his intensity making her pull back slightly. And because I can give you something you want more than anything, your freedom. What do you want from me? Alexander opened a leather briefcase he had brought with him and pulled out a series of documents yellowed with time. I have a copy of the fraudulent contract Gregory used to destroy my father. For years I've tried to prove it was fake, but every expert I consulted said it was technically perfect. Chemically, physically, legally, there's nothing wrong with it. Susan looked at the papers with growing curiosity. There was something familiar about them, something that awakened a memory buried deep in her mind. But you're not just anyone, Susan, Alexander continued, watching her carefully. You're the granddaughter of Edmund Hartwell, one of the most respected conservators of historical documents in the country. You grew up in his laboratory, learned to read the soul of manuscripts, as he used to say. Susan's eyes widened. How did he know about her grandfather, about the afternoons spent in his laboratory, learning to identify forgeries through details that other experts missed? Gregory investigated you too, Alexander explained, noticing her expression. He knows about your talent. That's why the marriage had to happen quickly, before you could use your abilities against him. Susan felt a new wave of revulsion. He knew I could expose him. He knew you were the only person in the world capable of seeing what everyone else missed. Alexander leaned even closer, his voice becoming urgent. Susan, I can protect you and your family from Gregory. I can guarantee you'll never have to worry about money again. But in return, I need you to do what you were born to do. Find the truth in these documents. Susan looked at the papers again, this time with the eyes of someone trained to see beyond the surface. And for the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten existed. Purpose. If I agree, she said slowly, it's not just about money or protection, is it? Alexander smiled, and this time there was something fierce and satisfied in the expression. No, it's about justice. It's about making Gregory pay for every life he's destroyed. The cafe around them seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the two of them and the promise of a battle that had begun long before they met. Susan knew that her answer would change everything. For her, for Alexander, for Gregory Steele. When do we start? She asked, and saw something like pride shine in Alexander's blue eyes. The rain had stopped when they left the cafe, but the streets still gleamed like black mirrors under the streetlights. Susan held the documents against her chest, protecting them from the remaining moisture in the air as they walked back to Alexander's car. There was something almost sacred in the way she carried those papers, as if they were relics from a past life that could finally reveal their secrets. Tell me about your grandfather, Alexander said as they drove through the empty, early morning streets. His voice had lost the hardness from earlier moments, replaced by a genuine curiosity that made Susan relax slightly. She rested her head against the seat back, her eyes lost in the lights passing by the window. Grandpa Edmund was magical, I guess. He had this laboratory in the basement of his house, full of microscopes, magnifying glasses, chemicals that smelled like history. He used to say that every document had a soul, a story to tell beyond the words written on it. A gentle smile touched her lips as the memories returned. I used to spend every summer with him. While other kids played at the beach, I was down there learning to distinguish iron gall ink from synthetic ink, to identify handmade paper by touch, to read the micro-expressions in handwriting that reveal the emotional state of the person writing. He saw you as his successor, Alexander observed, and it wasn't a question. Yes, he did. Susan's voice grew quieter, heavy with longing. He died when I was 15. After that, my parents thought it was better for me to focus on more practical things. They didn't understand that this wasn't just a hobby for me, it was who I was. Alexander stopped at a red light and turned to look at her. And you let them convince you to abandon it all. Susan felt a pang of guilt. I was young, I wanted to please them, and after Grandpa's death, going into that laboratory was too painful. So I packed it all away in a box at the back of my mind and tried to be the daughter they wanted me to be. But talent doesn't disappear, Alexander said softly. It just waits for the right opportunity to resurface. They arrived at an elegant residential building on the Upper East Side. Alexander led her to a private elevator that went straight to his apartment, a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor. When the doors opened, Susan couldn't contain a gasp of admiration. The space was a perfect fusion of modern minimalism and human warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while carefully selected artworks adorned the walls. But what really captured her attention was what she saw through the open glass doors, a library that looked like something out of a dream, with shelves reaching to the ceiling and a polished wooden rolling ladder. "You like books?" she said, more an observation than a question. "I like knowledge," Alexander corrected, following her gaze, "and preserving important things, just like your grandfather did." He led her to the library, where a work table was set up with equipment that made Susan's heart race with recognition: digital microscopes, portable spectrometers, UV lamps, analysis trays. It was a modern laboratory, but one that maintained the essence of the place where she had learned to love her craft. "How did you get all this?" she asked, running her fingers reverently over a microscope that cost more than a car. "I became very successful at recovering what Gregory took from me," Alexander replied. But there was a bitterness in his voice that suggested success had cost more than money. "The technology company I built specialized in digital forensic analysis. I learned that truth always leaves traces. You just need to know where to look." Susan carefully opened the folder with the historical documents. The contract was in excellent condition, but even so she could feel the weight of years on it. Her hands trembled slightly when she touched the paper, not from nervousness, but from excitement. It was like reuniting with a lost love. "Talk me through what you're seeing," Alexander said, pulling up a chair beside her. Susan picked up a magnifying glass and began examining the document with the same reverence a pianist touches the first notes after years away from the instrument. "The paper is quality cotton, probably European by the texture. The ink appears consistent with the period, but—" She stopped, frowning. "But what?" "It's hard to explain. It's like when you've known someone for years and suddenly notice something different about their smile. There's something here that doesn't fit, but I can't identify what." Susan picked up the microscope and adjusted the focus. "The handwriting is perfect, almost too perfect. Whoever forged this knew the 19th century very well." Alexander leaned closer, and Susan could feel the warmth emanating from him, the intensity of his concentration. "My father always said there was something wrong with that contract. He had an instinct for these things." "Instinct is real," Susan murmured, lost in her work. "Grandpa used to say that fake documents try too hard to convince you they're real. They're like liars. They always add too many details." For hours, she worked in silence, using every technique Edmund had taught her. Alexander remained by her side, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just watching in respectful silence. There was something deeply intimate about this shared vigil, as if they were archaeologists exploring the wreckage of destroyed lives. "The ink is correct for the period," Susan finally said, rubbing her tired eyes. The paper, too. The handwriting is from someone who actually lived in that era, but you still feel something's wrong. Yes. Susan pulled away from the microscope, frustrated. It's as if someone took all the right ingredients, but combined them in a way that shouldn't exist, like an ancient recipe made with modern techniques. Alexander remained silent for a long moment, studying her face. You're doing exactly what Gregory feared you would do, seeing what others can't see. But I'm not seeing enough, Susan said, her voice heavy with frustration. There's something here. I know there is, but I can't find it. Maybe because you're looking in the wrong place, Alexander suggested gently. Your grandfather taught you to read documents, but maybe the answer isn't in the document itself. Susan looked up at him. What do you mean? Edmund Hartwell was famous for saying that forgeries always carry the mark of the time they were created, not the time they try to imitate. Maybe you need to stop looking at the 19th century and start looking at the 21st. His words hit Susan like lightning. Suddenly she understood what had been eluding her perception. It wasn't just about analyzing the document. It was about understanding the context in which it was created. You're right, she whispered, picking up the magnifying glass again. If Gregory forged this recently, he might have used materials that look old but have modern characteristics that didn't exist in the original era. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since they met, the smile reached his eyes. Now you're thinking like Edmund Hartwell's granddaughter. Susan felt a wave of renewed energy. For the first time in years, she was doing what she was born to do, and for the first time since meeting Gregory Steele, she felt she had real power to fight against him. I need more equipment, she said, her voice gaining strength and determination, and I need information about when and where Gregory had access to these documents. You'll have everything you need, Alexander promised. Susan, you just took the first step toward destroying the man who ruined our lives. As they worked into the early morning hours, Susan felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she should be doing. And as scary as it was to admit, Alexander's constant presence by her side made everything seem not just possible, but inevitable. Golden morning light filtered through the penthouse's panoramic windows when Susan finally lifted her eyes from the documents. She had lost track of time, completely absorbed in the work she had forgotten how much she loved. Beside her, Alexander kept her coffee cup always full and had traded his impeccable suit for a casual white linen shirt that made him seem more human, more approachable. You need to sleep, he said gently, noticing how she swayed slightly in her chair. I can't stop now, Susan murmured, but her eyelids felt heavy as lead. I'm so close to something, I can feel it. Alexander gently took the magnifying glass from her hands. You're not a machine, Susan. And besides, sometimes the mind finds answers when we stop forcing it to search. She wanted to protest, but when she looked at him, really looked, she saw something that made her pause. There was genuine care in his blue eyes, a concern that went beyond the need to expose Gregory. He cared about her as a person, not just as a tool for his revenge. You didn't sleep either, she observed, noticing the subtle lines of fatigue around his eyes. I'm used to it. I built an empire working while others slept. Alexander paused, studying her face. But you're different. You're not driven by the same fury that keeps me awake. Susan stood from the chair, stretching muscles that protested from hours of immobility. She still wore yesterday's wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained, a constant reminder of how completely her life had changed in a matter of hours. I don't have anything else to wear, she said, suddenly conscious of her appearance. I've already taken care of that. Alexander gestured toward an adjacent room. There are clothes in the guest room closet. They should fit. Susan stared at him in surprise. How did you... I have efficient assistants, he replied with a half smile. And a good eye for sizes. There was something in the way he said it, casual but observant, that made Susan realize Alexander had noticed much more about her than just her ability with ancient documents. The thought should have bothered her, but instead, she felt a strange wave of warmth. The guest room was a sanctuary of calm in shades of grey and navy blue, with a bed that looked like a cloud and an equally spectacular view of the city. In the closet, she found casual but elegant clothes, jeans that seemed custom cut for her, silk blouses in tones that complemented her skin, even lingerie in her exact size. The precision was both impressive and slightly disturbing. Alexander was clearly a man who paid attention to details, who planned ahead. She wondered how long he had been observing her life before appearing in that car. When she emerged from the room an hour later, wearing dark jeans and a navy blue silk blouse, she found Alexander in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like a complete breakfast. He had changed the linen shirt for a charcoal grey cashmere sweater that accentuated the color of his eyes. "You cook?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "One of many skills you develop when you grow up without family to take care of you," he replied without bitterness, just as a fact. "Omelet's almost ready." Susan approached the kitchen counter, watching him work. His movements were economical and precise, like everything he did. "Alexander, can I ask how you built all this? I mean, from a teenager in foster homes to this." She gestured around the luxurious penthouse. He flipped the omelette with a fluid motion before answering. "Anger can be powerful fuel when directed correctly. I studied until my eyes bled, got scholarships, worked 3 jobs in college. I learned that the best revenge against those who try to destroy you is to become indestructible. And after all this success, do you still feel the same anger?" Alexander paused, spatula suspended over the pan. The anger changed. It became colder, more focused. "Gregory taught me that the world isn't fair, that powerful people step on the weak because they can. So I became more powerful than him." He served the omelette on fine porcelain plates and gestured for her to sit at the counter. "But last night working with you was the first time in years I remembered what it's like to have a purpose beyond revenge." Susan felt her heart race slightly. "What do you mean? You have genuine passion for what you do. It's not about money or power for you. It's about truth, about honoring your grandfather's memory. It's about something bigger than yourself." Alexander sat beside her, so close she could feel the warmth emanating from him. It had been a long time since I'd seen someone so pure in their motivations. Susan lowered her eyes to her plate, suddenly shy. "I don't feel pure. I feel like a coward who took too long to do the right thing. Would you marry Gregory knowing what you know now?" "Never," she answered without hesitation. "Then you're not a coward. You're someone who was operating with incomplete information." Alexander gently touched her arm. "And now that you have the complete story, you're willing to fight. That's not cowardice, that's evolution." They ate in comfortable silence, and Susan realized it was the first time in years she had felt truly relaxed in a man's presence. With Gregory, there was always tension, the feeling of being evaluated, judged, found lacking. With Alexander, there was something different, mutual respect, a partnership based on shared understanding. "Can I see the rest of the house?" she asked when they finished eating. Alexander smiled, a real smile that completely transformed his face. "Of course, there's something I want to show you." He led her through the apartment, pointing out artworks he had collected over the years, rare books he had acquired, small treasures that told the story of a man who had built a carefully curated life. But it was when they reached a discreet door at the end of the hallway that he stopped. "This is my favorite place in the entire apartment," he said, opening the door. Susan gasped. On the other side was a secret garden, a private terrace transformed into a green oasis in the middle of the concrete jungle. Lush plants created intimate corridors. A small fountain provided the gentle sound of running water, and strategically positioned benches offered views of both the garden and the city below. "It's impossible," she whispered, walking among the plants. "How does this exist up here?" "Everything is possible when you have enough determination," Alexander replied, but his voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. "I created this place when I realized I had become so focused on building walls against the world that I had forgotten what it felt like to feel peace." Susan turned to face him. "And does it work? Do you feel peace here?" "I used to feel loneliness here," he admitted, "until last night." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Susan felt something stirring in her chest, something that had been asleep for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. It wasn't just gratitude or relief at being saved. It was something deeper, more dangerous. "Alexander," she began, but he shook his head. "You don't need to say anything," he said softly. "I know all this is complicated. You just escaped a forced marriage. Your entire life changed overnight. I'm not asking anything from you beyond your help with Gregory." But the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking, contradicted his careful words. "And if I wanted to give more than just help?" Susan asked, surprised by her own courage. Alexander went still, as if he had stopped breathing. "Then I would say you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, and that Gregory Steele had no idea what treasure he was trying to buy." The morning sun bathed the garden in golden light, and Susan felt she was on the threshold of something monumental, not just the discovery that could destroy Gregory, but the possibility of building something new and beautiful from the ashes of what he had tried to break. "Let's find the proof you need," she said, her voice firm with new determination. "And then, let's make Gregory pay for everything he took from us." Alexander smiled, and this time there was something fierce and hopeful in the expression. "Together?" "Together," Susan confirmed, and they sealed the agreement not with a handshake, but with a look that promised that, regardless of what they found, they wouldn't face it alone. The following days transformed into an obsessive dance between Susan and the documents that held Gregory Steele's secrets. Alexander's penthouse became her laboratory, her sanctuary, her entire world. She arrived at the library before dawn and worked until the stars appeared over Manhattan, lost in a universe of magnification and chemical analysis. Alexander respected her concentration with the reverence of someone who understood obsession. He appeared silently with food trays that Susan barely touched, coffee she drank absent-mindedly, and sometimes just sat nearby, working on his laptop, offering the quiet company of someone who also knew the loneliness of relentless pursuit. "You're losing weight," he observed on the fourth morning, when Susan emerged from the library with deep dark circles and hands trembling slightly from caffeine and exhaustion. "I'm close to something," she murmured, walking past him toward the equipment. "I can feel it, Alexander. There's something here that everyone missed, including me. But I know it's here." She had created a complete calligraphic profile of everyone involved in the original contract, analyzed every fiber of the paper under different wavelengths of light, tested the ink with infrared spectroscopy. She had charts spread across the entire table, enlarged photographs of signatures, ink samples from different eras organized in precise rows. "Susan," Alexander said gently, but she was already back at the microscope, adjusting the focus with fingers that knew every colored dial. "Jonathan Whitmore's signature is perfect," she murmured to herself, as she had hundreds of times in the past few days. "Too perfect. The pressure is too consistent. There's no natural variation you'd see in someone signing an important document. But the ink is authentic for the period." Alexander approached, watching her work with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. There was something almost magical in the way she moved between instruments, as if each tool were an extension of her senses. But there was also something self-destructive in her total dedication. "What if you're looking for something that doesn't exist?" he asked gently. Susan stopped, her hands freezing over the microscope. "Are you doubting me?" "I'm worried about you," Alexander replied honestly. "You haven't slept properly in 4 days. You've barely eaten. You're consuming yourself over something that might be impossible to prove." Susan turned to face him, and Alexander saw something wild and desperate in her eyes. "My grandfather always said that when you know something is wrong but can't prove it, it's because you're looking in the wrong place, not at the wrong thing, in the wrong place." "Then change your perspective," Alexander suggested. "I've tried," Susan exploded, her patience finally exhausted. "I've analyzed from the 19th century, the 20th century, the 21st century. I've looked at chemicals, at paper, at handwriting, at historical context. There's nothing, Alexander. Absolutely nothing." Her voice broke on the last word, and suddenly all the determination that had sustained her for the past few days collapsed. Susan sank into her chair, hiding her face in her hands, and Alexander could see her shoulders shaking with contained tears. "I can't do it," she whispered. "I failed you, I failed my grandfather, I failed myself. Gregory is going to get away with it again, and I'm worthless." Alexander felt something contract painfully in his chest, seeing Susan fall apart. Over the past few days, he had watched a brilliant and passionate woman emerge from the ashes of the insecure bride who had hidden in his car. Seeing this strength fragment was almost unbearable. Without saying a word, he knelt beside her chair, gently moving her hands away from her face. "Look at me, Susan." She raised her eyes, and Alexander saw all the pain and disappointment she had been hiding behind her fierce determination. "You didn't fail," he said firmly. "You did something the country's best forensic experts couldn't do. You confirmed there's no obvious physical evidence of forgery. That's not failure, that's science. But it doesn't prove Gregory is guilty." "No," Alexander agreed, "but maybe because you're looking for the wrong kind of proof." Susan stared at him through her tears. "What do you mean?" Alexander stood, extending his hand to her. "Come with me, you need to get out of this laboratory." "Alexander, I can't stop now." "You can and you will," he said with gentle but irrefutable authority. "Trust me." Reluctantly, Susan took his hand and allowed him to lead her away from the documents, through the apartment, to the secret garden on the terrace. The afternoon air was fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the closed atmosphere of the library. Alexander guided her to a bench positioned to capture both the sunlight and the city view. "Sit," he said, "and breathe." Susan obeyed, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. The scent of the surrounding plants, the soft sound of water from the fountain, the feeling of sun on her face, all of it began to untangle the knots of tension that had formed in her shoulders and neck. "Now," Alexander said, sitting beside her, "tell me about your grandfather. Not about the techniques he taught, but about who he was." Susan opened her eyes, surprised by the question. "Why?" "Because you're trying to solve this mystery like a machine, when your greatest asset has always been your humanity. Your grandfather didn't just teach you techniques, he taught you intuition." Susan was quiet for a long moment, letting the memories return. "He used to say that fake documents always try to compensate for their dishonesty by being too perfect. Like people who lie. They add unnecessary details to make the lie seem more convincing." "And you found that excessive perfection in the contract?" "Yes, in the handwriting, but that's not enough to—" Susan stopped talking, a strange expression crossing her face. "What is it?" "He also said that forgers always make the same mistake. They get so focused on imitating the object that they forget to imitate the time." Susan turned to Alexander, excitement growing in her voice. "What if I'm looking at the document when I should be looking at the world around the document?" Alexander felt a wave of hope. "Continue. A contract doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are shipping records, import records, material purchase records. If Gregory forged this recently, he had to get period paper and ink somewhere." Susan stood abruptly, renewed energy coursing through her veins. "I need records from auction houses, antique dealers, specialized importers." "I can get that," Alexander said immediately, "and records of when those materials arrived in the United States when they became available for purchase." Susan began pacing back and forth, her mind working quickly. If he used authentic materials but obtained them recently, he might have left a trail that has nothing to do with the document itself. Alexander smiled, recognizing the spark of genius he had seen in her that first night. "You want to look for anachronisms, not in the document, but in the availability of materials used to create it." "Exactly." Susan turned to him, her eyes shining with an intensity that made Alexander's heart race. "Grandpa always said that historical context is as important as the object itself. A 19th century document made with ink that only arrived in the US in the 21st century would be impossible. Even if the ink is chemically identical to 19th century ink?" "Especially if it's chemically identical," Susan replied, her voice gaining strength. "Because that would mean someone got an exact formulation of historical ink, something that would only be possible with access to modern chemical analysis records." Alexander stood, moving toward her. "Susan, you're brilliant." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I was being stupid, focusing so much on the object that I forgot about the world. My grandfather would be disappointed." "Your grandfather would be proud," Alexander corrected, stopping in front of her. "You just found an approach that no one else thought to try." His proximity, the intensity in his blue eyes, the way he looked at her as if she had just moved mountains, all of it made Susan realize something that had been growing between them, during the days of shared work. "Alexander," she began, but the words died when he raised his hand and gently touched her face. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly. "Watching your mind work, seeing you rediscover who you really are. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Susan felt her heart race. "I don't feel extraordinary. I feel like someone who finally woke up after years of sleeping." "Then welcome back to the world," Alexander murmured, and there was something in his voice that made Susan realize they were no longer talking just about documents and investigations. The sun was setting behind them, painting the garden in golden and red tones, and Susan knew she was about to discover something much more dangerous and vital than any secret Gregory Steele might be hiding. Dawn found Susan and Alexander at what had become their command post. The library transformed into an operations center, with stacks of documents strategically scattered and 3 laptops open displaying spreadsheets, import records, and auction house catalogs. The energy between them had changed since the conversation in the garden. There was a new intensity, a mutual awareness that made every accidental touch of hands feel electric. "I found something," Susan said, her voice hoarse from fatigue but vibrating with excitement. She had been working since 3 in the morning, following a trail she had discovered in specialized chemical import records. Alexander approached from behind her, and Susan could feel the warmth of his body as he leaned over her shoulder to see the screen. "What did you find?" "A company called Heritage Inks, specializing in reproducing historical ink formulations for restoration and academic research." Susan pointed to a specific entry in the record. They imported a very specific batch of gum arabic and iron sulfate from the same region in France where original 19th century ink was produced. "And this is significant because this specific formulation, look here." Susan opened a new window, showing a detailed chemical analysis. This exact formulation was only identified and catalogued in 2018 when a laboratory at the Sorbonne analyzed preserved inkwells from a 19th century Parisian office. Alexander felt a shiver of understanding. So, before 2018, no one knew the exact formulation. Exactly. And even after 2018, it took 2 years for someone to reproduce it commercially. Susan clicked on another document. Heritage Inks received their first shipment of the specific ingredients in March 2020. 5 years before the contract that ruined my father was discovered in Gregory's archives. Susan turned in her chair to face him, her eyes shining with triumph. "Alexander, if Gregory used this ink in the contract, he couldn't have forged it in 1987 when your father died. He would only have had access to this specific formulation after 2020. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "But how do we prove he used specifically this ink?" "That's where the hard part comes in," Susan admitted. "I need a sample of the ink from the contract for spectrographic analysis, and I need to compare it with known samples from Heritage Inks." "How do we get samples from Heritage Inks?" Susan smiled, and there was something mischievous in the expression that made Alexander realize she had thought several steps ahead. "I already asked. I said I was doing academic research on authentication of historical documents. They were very happy to help. They even sent samples from different batches." "You're brilliant," Alexander said, and there was something more than admiration in his voice. "I'm not finished yet," Susan replied, but her cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "The really interesting part is this." She opened an obscure academic journal on her tablet. "I found the original Sorbonne article that identified the formulation. It's in French, but basically they discovered that the Parisian inkwells contained a specific proportion of oak tannin that was unique to the Bordeaux region." Alexander leaned closer, his breath making Susan's hair move slightly. "And this specific proportion was only commercially available after Heritage Inc. secured a supplier in Bordeaux in September 2020. Susan opened a new window, showing customs records. "Look at this. The first shipment arrived in the United States in October 2020, 3 months before the contract was found in Gregory's archives." Susan nodded vigorously. "If I can prove that the ink in the contract contains this specific proportion of Bordeaux tannin, we'll have absolute proof that the document was created at the earliest in October 2020, not 1987. Alexander went still, and Susan could see the exact moment when the magnitude of the discovery hit him. "Susan, you just found the temporal impossibility my father always knew existed." "I still need to do the analysis," she reminded, but her own excitement was undeniable. "And Heritage Inc. needs to confirm they sold to Gregory or someone working for him." "I can handle Heritage Inc.'s," Alexander said, his voice gaining a determined quality that Susan had learned to recognize. "I have resources for discovering sales records." Susan studied him carefully. "Legal resources?" Alexander smiled, but there was something dangerous in the expression. "Effective resources." "Alexander," Susan said softly, "promise me we won't do anything that could invalidate any evidence we find." He paused, touched by the concern in her voice. "I promise. But Susan, do you understand what this means? If we're right, we not only prove Gregory forged the contract, we prove he forged it recently after he had already destroyed my family and was laying the groundwork to destroy yours." Susan felt a chill. He was planning this for years. "And using you as part of the plan," Alexander added, his voice growing colder. "The marriage wasn't just about controlling your father's debts. It was about having access to your skills, ensuring you could never expose him." The realization hit Susan like a punch to the stomach. He knew. From the beginning, he knew I could discover the truth. "That's why the rush for the wedding. That's why the pressure on your family." Alexander moved to stand in front of her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "But he underestimated you, Susan. He thought he could control you through fear and obligation. And if you hadn't appeared in that car—" "But I did appear," Alexander said firmly. "And you chose to trust me, chose to fight. Gregory may have planned this for years, but he didn't plan for us." Susan looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the man determined to destroy Gregory Steele, but someone who had become infinitely precious to her in a matter of days. The intensity in his blue eyes, the way his hands on her shoulders were both protective and reverent, his proximity that made her heart race. "We need to do the spectrographic analysis," she said, but her voice came out softer than intended. "Yes," Alexander agreed, but he didn't move away. "Susan, there's something I need to tell you." "What?" "When this is over, when Gregory is destroyed and you're free, I don't want this to end. Us, I mean." Susan felt her heart stop and then beat twice as fast. "Alexander, I know it's complicated. I know you just escaped a forced relationship, that your entire life is changing. I'm not asking for promises or decisions now." He paused, studying her face. "I just want you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with Gregory or revenge or our partnership. It has to do with who you are when you're completely absorbed in your work, how you look when you talk about your grandfather, the way you see beauty in things others consider mundane." Susan felt tears burn her eyes. "You see me like no one ever has. And you made me remember there's something beyond anger," Alexander replied. "That there's construction after destruction." They were so close now that Susan could see the small lines around his eyes, could feel his warm breath on her face. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the world reduced to just the two of them, to the unspoken possibilities hanging in the air between them. "The analysis," Susan finally whispered. "The analysis," Alexander agreed, but his eyes didn't leave hers. Susan smiled, feeling something new and powerful expanding in her chest. "Let's destroy Gregory Steele, and then let's find out what we built from what he tried to break." Alexander smiled back, and it was a smile that promised both revenge and rebirth. "Together?" "Together," Susan confirmed. And when he finally stepped away so she could work, they both knew they had found something infinitely more valuable than proof of a crime. They had found each other. The spectrographic analysis had confirmed the impossible, or rather, the inevitable. The ink samples from the contract contained exactly the same specific proportion of Bordeaux tannin that had only arrived in the United States in October 2020. Gregory Steele had signed his own sentence with the ink he thought would save him. Susan held the final report in her trembling hands, the numbers and graphs representing years of meticulous work and the revenge Alexander had waited decades for. "It's irrefutable," she said, her voice barely containing the mixture of triumph and relief. "Any court in the world would accept this evidence." Alexander studied the results with the intensity of a predator who had finally spotted his prey. "No," he said calmly, and the tone in his voice made Susan look at him with surprise. "What do you mean, no? A court isn't enough." Alexander stood from the work table and began pacing through the library, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture Susan had learned to recognize as his way of planning something significant. Gregory Steele isn't just a common criminal. He's a pillar of society, a respected philanthropist, a man who built his reputation on the destruction of others. Lawsuits can be suppressed, evidence can be questioned, lawyers can create doubt. Susan felt a chill in her stomach. So all this investigation was useless? On the contrary, Alexander stopped and turned to face her, his blue eyes shining with something that was part determination, part predatory satisfaction. "This evidence is perfect, but we're not going to use it in a private courtroom where Gregory can control the narrative. We're going to use it on the most public stage possible. What do you have in mind?" Alexander opened his laptop and navigated to an elegant website with black and gold design. The annual Steele Foundation Gala, the event of the year in New York high society. 500 of the most powerful and influential people in the city, all the major media networks, live streaming to international donors. Susan studied the website, recognizing famous names on the list of previous guests. It's Gregory's charity party. It's more than that. It's where he cultivates his image as a generous benefactor, where he forges political alliances, where he maintains his untouchable reputation. Alexander clicked on a specific section of the site. "And it's where he's going to be destroyed in front of everyone who matters to him." "How?" Susan asked, though part of her was already beginning to understand the cruel elegance of Alexander's plan. The gala always includes presentations by experts on the causes the foundation supports this year. Historical preservation, ironically. Alexander smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. They're still looking for an expert speaker on document authentication. Someone with impeccable credentials and a fascinating discovery to share. Susan felt her heart race. "You want me to present myself as an expert?" "I don't want you to present yourself as anything. You are an expert, the only person in the world who could have made this discovery." Alexander approached her, his intensity almost palpable. "Susan, you're going to take that stage as Edmund Hartwell's granddaughter, a respected document conservator giving an academic presentation on temporal anachronisms in historical forgeries. And Gregory? Gregory will be sitting in the front row, smiling for the cameras with no idea what's about to happen." Alexander paused, allowing the image to form in Susan's mind. "Until you start analyzing an example document that turns out to be the contract that destroyed my family." Susan felt a wave of terror and excitement. "Alexander, it's brilliant and absolutely terrifying." "It's justice," Alexander corrected. "Gregory destroyed my father publicly, made him look incompetent, dishonest, unworthy of trust. He's going to experience the same humiliation." Susan stood and began pacing around the room, her mind processing the implications. But what if something goes wrong? What if he finds out beforehand? What if... "Susan," Alexander intercepted her, his hands gently holding her arms. "You're the most qualified person in the world to give this presentation, and I'll be there, making sure everything goes as planned." "How will you ensure that?" Alexander smiled, and this time there was something genuinely amused in the expression. "Because I'm going to be the surprise donor of the evening. The man who made such a generous contribution to the foundation that he deserves special time on stage to present his protégé, a brilliant expert who made a revolutionary discovery about historical forgeries." Susan stared at him. "You're going to finance Gregory's own destruction?" "With the greatest pleasure," Alexander replied, "and the money will go to a good cause, the part of his foundation that actually helps people, not the part that exists to massage his ego." Susan felt renewed admiration for the way Alexander thought, always several steps ahead, always finding ways to turn his enemies' weapons against themselves. "And after the presentation?" "After the presentation, Gregory Steele will be exposed as a fraud in front of everyone who respects him. The recordings will be on every social network before he leaves the building. His reputation will be so completely destroyed that no lawyer in the world will be able to rebuild it." Susan imagined the scene, her on stage, the irrefutable evidence projected for everyone to see, the moment of recognition in Gregory's eyes when he realized he had been defeated. "And my family? Will they be safe?" "Your family will be free," Alexander assured her. "Because once Gregory is exposed, all the contracts he forced, all the debts he manipulated, will be questioned. Without his reputation to sustain his shady business, his empire will crumble." Susan felt something powerful expanding in her chest, not just the prospect of revenge, but the realization that she would be the instrument of justice, not a victim being saved, but a warrior fighting her own battle. "There's something else," Alexander said, his voice becoming softer. "After all this is over, you'll have a reputation as the expert who exposed one of the biggest frauds in recent history. Universities, museums, auction houses, they'll all want to work with you. Are you offering me a career?" "I'm offering you your life back," Alexander corrected. "The life you should have had if Gregory had never interfered, if you had never been forced to choose between your family and your dreams." Susan looked at him, at this man who had appeared on the darkest night of her life, and not only saved her, but given her a purpose, a future, something she didn't even know she wanted, until it was within reach. "When is the gala?" she asked. "Next Saturday. 7 days to prepare. 7 days to rehearse Gregory Steele's destruction. 7 days to ensure the presentation is perfect," Alexander corrected. "Because you'll only have one chance, Susan, one opportunity to make Gregory pay for everything he took from us." Susan felt a fierce determination taking hold of her. For years she had felt like a chess piece being moved by others. Now, finally, she would be the one delivering checkmate. "Let's do this," she said, her voice firm with a conviction that surprised her. "Let's make Gregory Steele pay for every life he destroyed." Alexander smiled, and there was as much pride as affection in the expression. "Together?" "Together," Susan confirmed, and when they embraced, a hug that was part celebration, part promise of battle, they both knew that in 7 days their lives would be completely different. The only question was whether Gregory Steele would survive what they were about to do to him. The night of the gala arrived, wrapped in an elegance that made the air vibrate with expectation. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel gleamed like a jewel, with crystal chandeliers casting golden prisms over the 500 most powerful guests in New York. Susan watched it all through the side curtains of the stage, her heart beating a rhythm that alternated between fierce determination and absolute terror. She was no longer the runaway bride who had hidden in Alexander's car a week ago. The dress she wore, navy blue silk that Alexander had personally chosen, embraced her curves with an elegance that spoke of quiet power. Her hair was pulled back in a sophisticated chignon that exposed the diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, a tangible connection to the legacy she was about to honor. "You look stunning," Alexander murmured, appearing beside her. He was impeccable in a tuxedo that had clearly been custom-made, but Susan could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curved slightly as if he were preparing for a fight. "I'm terrified," Susan admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notes. "Good," Alexander said, surprising her. "Fear means you understand the importance of what you're about to do. But remember, you're not lying, you're not exaggerating, you're not manipulating. You're presenting irrefutable scientific facts." Susan nodded, breathing deeply. They had rehearsed the presentation dozens of times over the past 7 days, but that didn't diminish the magnitude of the moment. "Where is he?" Alexander gestured discreetly toward the front row, table number 1 with his new bride. Susan followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. Gregory Steele was exactly where Alexander had predicted, smiling for the cameras with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. Beside him, a young blonde who couldn't be more than 22, clearly his replacement for Susan, another trophy for his collection. "She looks so young," Susan whispered. "She is young," Alexander replied, his voice loaded with cold fury. "And after tonight she'll be free of him too." A production assistant approached. "Dr. Davison, you're on in 2 minutes." Susan felt her legs almost give way. "Doctor? You have an honorary PhD from the university where your grandfather taught," Alexander explained quickly. "They were more than happy to officially recognize your contributions to the field when they learned of your discovery." Another surprise, More proof that Alexander had thought of everything. Susan looked at him, this extraordinary man who had orchestrated a revenge so complete it bordered on art. "Alexander, if something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," he interrupted, his hands finding hers. "But if it does, I'll be here. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this." The evening's presenter, a famous television anchor, took the stage. His voice echoed through the hall as he introduced Alexander as the generous anonymous donor who revealed himself to support crucial research in historical preservation. Alexander turned to Susan one last time. "Remember, you're not a victim seeking revenge. You're a scientist presenting a discovery. Let the evidence speak for itself." He took the stage to polite applause, and Susan watched as he worked the crowd with the same precision he did everything. He didn't mention Gregory by name, didn't make accusations, didn't reveal his personal motivations. Instead, he spoke eloquently about the importance of historical truth, about how modern technologies enabled discoveries that protected against elaborate frauds. "It's my pleasure to introduce one of the most brilliant minds in document authentication," Alexander said, his eyes meeting Susan's through the curtains. "Dr. Susan Davison, granddaughter of the legendary Edmund Hartwell, has made a discovery that redefines our understanding of historical forgeries. Dr. Davison." Susan walked onto the stage with steps that were steadier than she expected. The lights were blinding, but somehow she could see Gregory clearly, watching his expression change from casual curiosity to something closer to alarm when he recognized who she was. "Good evening," Susan began, her voice carrying more authority than she had ever felt. "Tonight, I want to share with you a discovery that illustrates how sophisticated criminals use modern knowledge to create historically impossible forgeries." She clicked the remote control, and the first image appeared on the screen behind her, the contract that had destroyed Alexander's family, projected in crystalline detail for everyone to see. "This document," Susan continued, "is a commercial contract supposedly from 1987. At first glance and under superficial examination, it appears completely authentic. The paper is period cotton, the ink is chemically consistent with 20th century formulations. The handwriting shows the kind of natural variation we would expect to see." She clicked again, and spectral analysis graphs filled the screen. However, deep spectroscopic analysis reveals something extraordinary and impossible. Susan could feel the crowd's attention intensifying. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Gregory lean forward, his fingers gripping his chair's armrest. "The ink used in this document contains a specific proportion of Bordeaux oak tannin that was first identified by Sorbonne researchers in 2018. Susan clicked to the next image, the import records she had discovered. This specific formulation was not commercially available in the United States until October 2020. A murmur ran through the hall. Susan saw journalists picking up their phones, cameras focusing more intensely on her presentation. "This means," Susan said, her voice gaining strength, "that this document could not have been created in 1987. It was forged at the earliest 3 years ago, using modern knowledge to create a temporal impossibility." She clicked to the final image, a photo of Robert Graves, Alexander's father, alongside documents from the company Gregory had stolen. This specific contract was used to justify the fraudulent acquisition of Graves Technologies in 1987, resulting in Robert Graves's premature death and the destruction of his family. Susan paused, allowing the words to impact the audience. The person responsible for this forgery not only committed fraud, they used modern technology to rewrite history and cover up a crime that ruined innocent lives. The silence in the hall was absolute. Susan could see Gregory slowly rising from his chair, his face having lost all color, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of terror and fury. "How dare you?" Gregory began to say, his voice carrying through the sound system because his table microphone was still open. "Mr. Steele," Susan said calmly, turning to face him directly, "do you have any explanation for how a document you supposedly signed in 1987 contains materials that only existed after 2020? The cameras turned to Gregory like hawks converging on prey. He looked around the hall, realizing that all the important people in his life were watching, waiting for an answer he couldn't give. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, but his voice had lost all the authority it used to carry. "That document, The laboratory that performed this analysis," Susan continued relentlessly, "confirmed that Heritage Inc. sold this specific ink formulation to your company in November 2020. We have the purchase records." Gregory looked desperately around the hall, searching for an exit, an ally, anything that could save him. But he found only shocked faces, cameras recording every second of his humiliation, and Alexander's cold eyes watching from the side of the stage. "Furthermore," Susan added, her voice now carrying an authority that made the entire hall fall into absolute silence, "we discovered evidence of at least 17 other documents forged using similar techniques, all used in questionable commercial acquisitions over the past 5 years. Gregory Steele, the man who had ruined so many lives, who had built an empire on the destruction of others, began to tremble. And then, in front of 500 of the country's most influential people, in front of cameras broadcasting live to the world, he collapsed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. I had to. Everything was falling apart, and I needed—" But his words were lost in the chaos that erupted when security moved toward him, when journalists ran forward, when Gregory Steele's world finally, inevitably, imploded. The silence in Alexander's penthouse was almost sacred after the chaos of the gala. Susan stood before the panoramic windows, still wearing the navy blue dress that had become her armor for the most important battle of her life, watching Manhattan's lights flicker like earthbound stars. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the entire presentation, now trembled slightly with adrenaline that was finally subsiding. Alexander entered the room silently, carrying 2 champagne flutes, but his movements had a different quality, lighter, as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally been removed from his shoulders. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie, and there was something almost vulnerable about his relaxed appearance. "The news is already on every channel," he said softly, offering Susan a glass. "Gregory was arrested before he could even leave the hotel. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze all his company assets. The FBI is investigating every contract he's signed in the past 10 years. Susan took the glass but didn't drink. "And the young woman who was with him?" "Free," Alexander replied, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. Apparently, she was already having doubts about the engagement. Watching her future husband get exposed as a criminal in front of 500 people was the confirmation she needed. Will she be okay? She'll be better than okay. I discovered she has her own trust fund. Gregory didn't have financial control over her like he had over your family." Alexander paused, studying Susan's profile against the city lights. "You saved more than one life tonight." Susan finally turned to face him, and Alexander could see tears shining in her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief so deep it seemed physical. "My mother called," she said, her voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "And?" "She was crying. She said my father was watching the news, and when he saw Gregory being arrested, he cried too. For the first time in 3 years, he cried." Susan paused, swallowing hard. She said they always knew something was wrong, but could never prove it. "And now they're free," Alexander finished gently. "They're free," Susan repeated, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. "And I did that. I really did that." Alexander approached her, stopping close enough that he could see every detail of her face in the room's soft light. "You were magnificent tonight, Susan. Not just brilliant or brave. You were absolutely magnificent. I couldn't have done it without you." Susan studied him, noticing how the light caught the golden tones in his dark hair, how the tension he always carried had finally dissipated. "Alexander, what happens now? For you, I mean. You spent so much time focused on destroying Gregory. Who are you when you don't have to do that anymore?" The question hit him in a way he clearly hadn't anticipated. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, looking at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Honestly, I don't know," he admitted. "For so long my entire life was built around this need for justice, this obsession with making Gregory pay. And now that it's over," he raised his eyes to meet hers, "I feel like I'm waking up from a very long dream, or maybe from a nightmare. Susan placed her glass on the table and moved closer to him. "And how does it feel to be awake?" "Scary," Alexander replied honestly. "And liberating, and—" He paused, a smile touching his lips. "Full of possibilities I had forgotten existed." On the television that was silently playing in the background, images of Gregory's arrest played on loop. His shocked face when the handcuffs were put on, the chaos of reporters shouting questions, the young bride being escorted away by federal agents who clearly saw her as a witness, not an accomplice. "Do you have any regrets?" Susan asked, watching the images. "About Gregory?" "None," Alexander replied without hesitation. "He made choices for decades that hurt innocent people. He could have stopped at any time, could have tried to make amends. Instead, he kept destroying lives." Alexander paused, turning to face her completely. "My only regret is how long it took me to find you." Susan felt her heart race. "Alexander, I know it's too early," he said quickly. "I know you just got out of a relationship that was forced on you, that your entire life is changing. I'm not asking for promises or decisions. I'm just being honest about what I feel." "And what do you feel?" Susan asked softly. Alexander took a deep breath as if preparing to jump off a cliff. "I feel like you brought me back to life, not just because you helped me get justice for my father, but because, working with you, watching you rediscover who you really are, seeing the passion in your eyes when you talk about your research." He paused, searching for the right words. "Susan, I fell in love with you, not with the woman who helped me destroy Gregory, but with the woman who gets completely absorbed when examining a 300-year-old document, who talks about her grandfather as if he were still alive, who is brave enough to face her fears and smart enough to win." Susan felt tears burn her eyes again. "When did you know?" "Know what?" "That you were in love with me." Alexander smiled, and it was a smile that completely transformed his face, making him look years younger. "In the library on the second night you were here, you were so frustrated with the documents that you started talking to them, asking, 'What secret are you hiding from me?' as if they were real people. And I realized I was watching someone who saw magic where others saw just paper and ink. That's when I knew I was lost." Susan laughed through her tears. "I talk to documents? You talk to everything when you're concentrating. To microscopes that won't cooperate, to inks that won't reveal their secrets, to your grandfather when you need guidance." Alexander moved closer, his hands gently framing her face. "It's one of the most charming things I've ever seen." "Alexander," Susan whispered, "I fell in love with you too." "When?" he asked, echoing her earlier question. "In the garden, when you told me to stop looking at the document and start looking at the world around the document. Not because you gave me the answer, but because you saw me clearly enough to know exactly what I needed to hear." Susan paused, her eyes fixed on his. "And because when you hugged me after I had that breakdown, it was the first time in my life I felt completely safe." Alexander leaned his forehead against hers, and for a moment they stayed like that, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, letting the magnitude of what they had confessed settle between them. "Susan," he murmured, "I want to build something with you. I don't know exactly what yet, but I want to find out. I want to wake up tomorrow and ask myself what we can create together, instead of asking myself what I need to destroy." "I want that too," Susan replied. "But Alexander, I need you to know, I don't want to be saved by you. I want to be your partner, your equal." "You already are my equal," Alexander said firmly. "You proved that tonight. You proved it to me, to Gregory, to the entire world. Susan, you're not someone who needs to be saved. You're someone who saves others." He leaned in and kissed her then, soft and deep, a kiss that didn't speak of desperate passion or triumph over enemies, but of promises and possibilities, of futures built on solid foundations of mutual respect and true love. When they parted, Susan smiled. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Alexander said, his smile matching hers, "we find out who we are when we're not fighting Gregory Steele, and I suspect it's going to be a much better adventure than anything we've ever experienced." Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal dance of lights and movement, but inside the penthouse, two people who had lost so much had finally found everything that really mattered, in each other. 6 months later, Susan woke to the sound of gentle rain tapping on the windows of the laboratory that Alexander had created for her on the lower floor of the penthouse. It was a space that combined the best of modern technology with the timeless charm of her grandfather's laboratory. Oak shelves filled with rare books, state-of-the-art microscopes, and a work table positioned to capture perfect, natural morning light. She stretched in the leather armchair where she had fallen asleep while working late, pulling the cashmere blanket tighter around herself, the one Alexander had gently placed over her sometime in the early hours. On the table in front of her was her current project, a collection of 18th-century love letters that a Boston museum had hired her to authenticate. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Alexander's familiar voice echoed softly through the room. Susan turned to find him in the doorway, carrying a tray with coffee and what smelled suspiciously like homemade pancakes. He was wearing faded jeans and a light blue cotton shirt, a more relaxed version of the man she had met on that stormy night, but with the same intense blue eyes that still made her heart race. "You didn't need to bring breakfast," Susan said, but couldn't hide the smile that spread across her face. "Yes, I did," Alexander replied, setting the tray on a side table and leaning down to kiss her softly. "You've been working for almost 16 straight hours, and besides, we have a meeting in 2 hours." Susan frowned. "What meeting?" "With the director of the Metropolitan Museum," Alexander said, his smile becoming mischievous. "They want to discuss your proposal for the new art forensic analysis department." Susan's eyes widened. "Alexander, you didn't—" "I only casually mentioned that the woman who exposed Gregory Steele might be interested in expanding her work," he said innocently. "The rest was all your merit." Susan stood and hugged him, feeling happiness bubble in her chest like champagne. Over the past 6 months, job offers had come from museums, universities, and auction houses around the world. Her reputation as the expert who had unmasked one of the decade's biggest frauds had opened doors she didn't even know existed. "And you?" she asked, pulling back enough to study his face. "How's the foundation project going?" Alexander smiled, and there was a peace in his expression that still surprised her sometimes. After Gregory's arrest, he had sold part of his technology company and used the resources to create a foundation that helped families destroyed by corporate fraud, transforming his thirst for revenge into something constructive and healing. "Well," he said. "Very well, actually. We managed to help 12 families this month recover assets they had lost to fraudulent schemes, and the lawyer we hired says the Henderson family case will be resolved before Christmas." Susan felt a wave of pride. "Your father would be proud." "I think he would," Alexander agreed, his voice soft. "And your grandfather would be proud of you too. You didn't just honor his legacy, you expanded it." They moved together toward the windows, watching the city wake up below them. The rain had stopped, and rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the clouds, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the wet streets. "Alexander," Susan said softly, "can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever wonder what our life would be like if Gregory had never existed? If our families had never been hurt? If we had met in a normal way?" Alexander considered the question for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I realized we might not have met at all. You could have married someone from your social circle. I could have remained focused only on building companies. Gregory may have caused us pain, but he also brought us to each other." "Do you believe in destiny?" Susan asked. "I believe in choices," Alexander replied. "Gregory made choices that hurt people. We made choices that brought us justice, healing, and love. Maybe destiny put us on the same path, but it was our choices that determined where we ended up." Susan nestled against him, feeling the solidity of his embrace, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "And what choices do we make now?" "Well," Alexander said, his voice taking on a slightly nervous tone that made Susan look up at him with curiosity. "There's a specific choice I'd like to discuss with you." "What kind of choice?" Instead of answering, Alexander gently pulled away, and to Susan's absolute amazement, knelt in front of her. From somewhere, she had no idea where, he produced a small navy blue velvet box. "Susan Davison," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "You've transformed my life in ways I didn't know were possible. You taught me that there's something more powerful than revenge. There's love, there's partnership, There's the possibility of building something beautiful from the ashes of what others tried to destroy. Susan felt tears burn her eyes as he opened the box, revealing a ring that literally took her breath away. It was vintage, clearly a family piece, with a central diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires that perfectly matched her eyes. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," Alexander continued. "The only valuable thing I managed to save when our family was destroyed. I always thought I'd sell it someday, when I needed money. But now I want to give it to the only woman who made me believe in the future again." "Alexander," Susan whispered, barely able to speak through her tears. "I don't just want you to be my wife," he said, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. "I want you to be my partner in everything. In life, in work, in building something that honors both your grandfather and my father. I want to wake up beside you every day for the next 50 years and discover new reasons to fall in love with you." Susan was crying openly now, but they were tears of joy so pure it seemed impossible to contain them. "Susan Davison," Alexander said, his voice firm with absolute conviction, "will you marry me? Not because someone is forcing you, not for money or obligation, but because we choose to build a life together." "Yes," Susan said, and then louder, "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her, and then stood to kiss her with an intensity that spoke of promises and eternity. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too," Susan replied. "And Alexander. This time when I walk down the aisle, it will be because I choose to. Because we choose to." They stayed like that for a long moment, embraced in the golden morning light. Two people who had lost everything and found something infinitely more valuable on the journey back. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but inside the laboratory where Susan had rediscovered her purpose, two hearts that had been broken by Gregory's steel were finally whole again. And for the first time in their lives, the future seemed not just bright, but limitless. Susan had fled from a marriage that would imprison her, but found something that freed her completely. Sometimes, the moments that seem like the end of everything are just the beginning of who we really are. Alexander learned that revenge can destroy an enemy, but only love can heal a soul. And perhaps that's the most powerful truth of all, that two broken people can find each other in the fragments and build something more beautiful than anything that existed before. Because sometimes running away isn't cowardice, it's the courage to choose who you want to become. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and tell us where are you listening to this from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing you stories like this.